It is really important for a cell that when it is replicating its DNA, it doesn't make any mistakes. Because if it does make a mistake, that mistake could potentially result as a mutation in a gene that codes for a specific protein, which eventually might actually affect the way that that protein functions within the cell. So making sure that not only does DNA replication happen quickly, but it also happens effectively is really important. Lucky for the cells is that DNA polymerases kind of have a built-in spell checker, kind of like Microsoft Word. And this is a proofreading mechanism where the DNA polymerases will kind of check to make sure that they have just added the correct nucleotide to match what's in the template. And if they've made a mistake, they'll stop, replace with the correct nucleotide, and then continue moving forward. Now, DNA polymerases are still not foolproof, though. They might make some mistakes, and so there are other mechanisms in the cell that are called mismatch repair, where enzymes can come in and actually correct any errors in base pairing that may have been left behind after the DNA polymerases did their job. On top of that, the cells also have the ability to repair DNA. So DNA that's not necessarily being replicated can actually succumb to damage. Exposure to chemical or physical agents like cigarette smoke or X-rays can cause spontaneous changes in the DNA. Some of these spontaneous changes can be fixed by the cell so that the mutation isn't necessarily passed on to the next generation of cells. And an example of this kind of repair we're going to look at on the next slide. This is called nucleotide excision repair. This is where a nuclease will come in, detect the damaged DNA, and will cut it out and replace it with new, fresh nucleotides to prevent any mutations from arising in that DNA section. So let's take a closer look at this nucleotide excision repair. So this is an example of where DNA gets exposed to UV light. And what UV light can do is it's a form of energy. It can actually damage the DNA by causing what are called thymine dimers. So in the top strand of this template DNA, you'll notice two thymines that are close to UV light, and it caused a covalent bond to form between these two thymines that are next to each other, and it causes a little bit of a bulge in the DNA there. Now that in itself is not necessarily bad. It didn't change the sequence of the DNA, but if this cell were to go through mitosis or meiosis, that little bump in the DNA could cause the DNA replication machinery to stall and to perhaps put down the incorrect nucleotide, and then thus causing a mutation in the DNA. And so what will happen is an enzyme called a nuclease will come in, it'll recognize that damaged section of DNA, and it'll cut out the section along with several nucleotides on either side of that thymine dimer. Once the damaged DNA has been removed, DNA polymerases can come in, fill in with new, fresh, undamaged nucleotides. And then lastly, DNA ligase will come in and seal the sugar phosphate backbone, completing the repair of that damaged DNA segment. Now, even with proofreading and mismatch repair, and just in general repair of DNA, error rate of mistakes made in DNA is not zero, right? Every time the DNA is replicated, something is going to slip by, or when damage is done to the DNA, some mutation is going to occur. And some of these sequence changes may be permanent and can be passed on to the next generation of cells. Now, if you were to accumulate, let's say, a mutation in one of your skin cells, one of the genes in your skin cells, that will potentially be passed down to future skin cells, but you wouldn't pass that on to your offspring because your skin cells have nothing to do with reproduction. On the other hand, if a mutation takes place in a gamete or one of your egg or sperm cells, then yes, by all means, that mutation has the potential to be passed on to your offspring. And generally, mutations have a very negative connotation, but sometimes mutations or changes in the sequence of DNA can actually lead to better adaptation to a changing environment. And so really these changes or mutations in DNA are the basic source of genetic variation upon which natural selection actually operates in nature.